Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the Viking invasions. Episode 1 is called The Coming of the Sea Kings. We'll be talking about the original settlement of Scandinavia, how a real-life Ragnarok transformed Norse culture into Viking culture, the ships the Vikings used to settle and explore Russia, the beginning of the Viking Age, the rise of Thorgest the Sea King who ruled much of Ireland for a time, and how he made Ireland part of an international trade network that stretched from the British Isles to modern-day Russia. Viking trading, raiding, settlement, and conquest did so much to define the 800s and 900s that they are sometimes called the Viking Age. The Viking came from Scandinavia, descended from Germanic-speaking nations who migrated northwards about 4,000 years ago during the Bronze Age, bringing with them a belief in fierce gods who rewarded courage. Early in their history, these Germanic nations, later called the Norse, became seafarers to obtain the copper and tin needed to make bronze. At this time, the Scandinavians used small paddle boats powered by oars, which stuck close to the coasts. Muscle power took them throughout much of northern Europe. For getting around on land, the Norse typically used skis, likely learned from the early Russians. Despite their trade networks, most Scandinavians saw the farm as their main means of support. They sowed barley, rye, and oats during the short growing seasons, with summers sometimes lasting as few as 6 weeks. They also raised cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs. Most Scandinavians barely raised enough to support their families. These Scandinavians were polytheist, their pantheon including a god of skiing called Ullr. There were no great kingdoms, but each village had its own king, usually the man with the largest farm in the village. And dozens of petty kingdoms emerged in this fashion, throwing up rings of hill forts and battling for territory. Wars were often fought by breaking open the fence of a rival village and looting everything they could get their hands on. So why did the Norse leave home after centuries of largely keeping to themselves? While Rome was falling, Scandinavia faced its own problems, not barbarian hordes but a natural disaster, likely a pair of volcanic eruptions that threw up so much dust and ash that the sun darkened in 536. Summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere lowered for several centuries. Already on the northern edge of medieval agriculture, this extended cold and darkness brought ruin to Scandinavia. In some areas, up to 75% of the population died from starvation or fighting. This catastrophe may have inspired the Viking idea of RAGNAROK, the final battle in which all gods, humans, and other creatures would die. Indeed, Ragnarok was said to begin in an age called Fimbulwinter, when the sun darkened, a mist covered the sky, and the earth endured 3 winters with no summer, which certainly reminds one of the cataclysm of 536. During this upheaval, new leaders surrounded themselves with heavily armed war bands and seized whatever land they could. As many as 1 in 2 men were buried with weapons in some parts of Sweden, a sign of just how militarized Norse society became. A sign of changing times, the gods Odin and Thor took preeminence in the Scandinavian pantheon during this cataclysm. Odin would become the quintessential god of the Viking Age. According to tradition, Odin hung himself from a tree for 9 days, learning the runes as payment for his ordeal. He also ruled the Great Hall of Valhalla, where warriors who died in combat would be taken by Valkyries for an eternity of feasting and brawling. This would prepare them to serve in Odin's army during Ragnarok. So Norse religion literally provided a reason for men to become warriors. And as if that weren't reason enough, post-disaster Scandinavia had a gender imbalance, with more men than women. So many young armed men were eager to go abroad to woo, purchase, or steal a wife. However, they wouldn't get very far without ships. During the Roman era, Scandinavians copied the sail from the Romans. By adding a sail to their ships, the Norse could use the wind to speed their journey and save themselves a lot of backaches from rowing. As they drew closer to the Viking Age, the Scandinavians also developed the keelson, a thick base which helped to support the weight of a large mast and sail. With these innovations, the Norse sailed faster and farther, making it as far south as the Mediterranean. By the Viking Age, these ships could be up to 75 feet long, with masts 45 feet high and capable of holding 60 warriors each. They might be only 18 inches below the waterline and have wide, flat hulls that minimize drag. They also had holes for 16 oars on both sides, with men working in double shifts rowing. These ships were built for speed. Timbers were cut along the grain with wedges instead of against the grain with axes, which kept the wood's natural strength and also gave the ship more flexibility, meaning that it would bend in heavy waves instead of breaking apart. And the keel itself was made from a single timber that could be over 60 feet long. To store goods below decks, including slaves, Vikings had removable planks on the decks to open and close the hold. However, another thing that set Viking ships apart was the sail. Vikings rigged their ships for sailing, but precise records of how they set up their rigging do not survive. Most sails at the time were made of linen, but Viking sails were made of wool. Part of this was convenience, as wool was available to the Scandinavians while linen wasn't. Yet these woolen sails gave Viking sails an elasticity lacking in other nations' ships, allowing them to catch more wind. The wool used in their sails also came from a breed of sheep with naturally water-repellent wool, giving them another advantage. And all these pluses allowed Viking longships to move along the water like a hydrofoil, reaching speeds as high as 16 knots per hour, as fast as a modern-day yacht. Around the 750s, Viking ships began to explore the Arctic regions of what is today Finland and Russia, using bases as jumping-off points for exploring, trading, and raiding the Dnieper and Volga River valleys. When they brought Finnish translators to speak for them further inland, the Finns referred to the Vikings as the Rus, and the name stuck, which is where we get the name Russia. The great Russian rivers were not easy sailing. Boulder-studded rapids with names like Don't Fall Asleep waited for travelers, as did shallows where crews would have to haul the ships and cargo onto dry land and portage them on logs, while Pecheneг tribes waited in ambush. During these dangerous voyages, Vikings collected timber, amber, honey, furs, and either abducted or purchased locals to sell as slaves as far south as Baghdad and Constantinople. They traded these goods for Chinese silk, spices, and silver. Some Vikings even established trade outposts along the Dnieper and Volga rivers that grew into bustling communities as more of their countrymen sailed down the rivers to trade. Viking trade would soon extend as far west as the British Isles, where they saw rich monasteries dotting the coasts. Many of these monasteries had grown wealthy from gifts of gold and silver given by wealthy Anglo-Saxons who hoped to show their piety and perhaps become the beneficiary of a miracle or two. Since the Anglo-Saxons saw them as holy places, the monasteries were completely undefended. Of course, the Vikings just saw soft targets filled with movable wealth, so it was only a matter of time before the Vikings decided to just help themselves to all of the gold and silver in the monasteries. On the year the Viking Age began, 793 AD, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported a number of terrifying omens over the kingdom of Northumbria. The writers reported great flashes of lightning, terrifying dragons flying in the air, and a great famine which afflicted the whole country. Of course, the Chronicle was written many years later, and these events may have been added as a dramatic flourish by those who knew what would come that year. Omens or not, the Viking Age began when 3 ships docked at the shore by the Abbey of Lindisfarne. The Abbey's reeve, Butaherd, recognized the longships and believed the men to be Norse traders from the land that he called Ar-Nor. Assuming they lost their way, Butaherd approached the ships to direct them up the coast to a nearby estate, a frequent destination for merchants. As he approached, Butaherd was murdered by the sailors, the first victim of the Viking Age. The sailors then ransacked the abbey and murdered everyone they found. When word came about this success, whole villages back home in Scandinavia began building ships. Next year, Viking ships plundered the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria, and the monastery of Iona in Scotland faced 3 raids over the next 11 years. Of course, to the Anglo-Saxons, the attacks against the monasteries was not just an appalling crime, but a sacrilege. Vikings, being pagans, had no such scruples about setting hands on the sacred monasteries. However, the faith of the Anglo-Saxons in these monasteries was so great that when the patron saints of these monasteries failed to punish the Viking raiders immediately, the Anglo-Saxons became profoundly demoralized, and many believed that the god had sent the Vikings to punish them for their sins. On the other hand, these early successes encouraged the Vikings to start larger expeditions, and soon Viking attacks extended to Francia, where navigable rivers like the Loire made for easy inland journeys. About 120 villages in Francia were razed over the next 40 years, with the populations either slaughtered or carried off into slavery, and the riches within their churches looted. As the Vikings realized that the British Isles and Francia enjoyed a more temperate climate than their homeland, they began to establish winter quarters there as forward bases for raiding. And in time they carried out raids further into Ireland, targeting the powerful monasteries. The preferred Viking tactic became targeting the gold-covered, jewel-encrusted books of the monasteries, literally holding them for ransom until the abbots coughed up a hefty fee to ensure the safe return of their sacred texts. However, the Viking Age in the British Isles entered a whole new phase in AD 837 when the Irish kings of Tara and Munster went to war. Lesser kings took sides and soon war spread across Ireland. A Viking war chief named Thorgest the Sea King took advantage of the situation, arriving with a staggering 120 longships, the largest Viking fleet yet seen. And he plundered the monastery of Armagh, defiling the altar that St. Patrick himself installed and ordained. Scholars were slaughtered, sacred books burned, and reliquaries scattered in the streets like rubbish. As if to mock the Christians, Thorgest declared himself abbot and continued to collect taxes. His ships seized control of river valleys to control both trade and taxes. In AD 841, Thorgest extended his kingdom to the river Liffey, building a ship harbor there that doubled as a winter camp. And in time, Thorgest built a fortified port city further inland called Dublin. From Dublin, Thorgest carried out further attacks against Ireland, and for a time, it looked as if Thorgest might become the king of all Ireland. But his death in battle in 845, followed by a civil war among the Irish Vikings, put an end to that dream. However, Dublin would survive for generations as the center of a Viking kingdom and the center of the European slave trade, exporting Anglo-Saxons and Franks. So, where did these slaves wind up? They faced a weeks or months-long voyage in the holds of Viking longships and knarrs, joining people taken as tribute from the Finns and the Slavs in Eastern Europe. They came along with hazelnuts, honey, maple wood, and spotted furs. During transportation on the Volga and Dnieper rivers, slaves were treated well and dressed appropriately. This was not out of concern for the slaves, but to keep them in good health for presentation to buyers along the Volga and Dnieper rivers and possibly as far south as Constantinople and Baghdad. Women were forced to fornicate with their Viking masters en route, while men would often be castrated upon arrival in Islamic slave ports. Viking slave traders became fabulously wealthy from the Russian slave trade, amassing fortunes in Islamic coins and decorating their wives and daughters with silver jewelry. They also painted their eyes, wore jackets with tassels and braids, wore neck rings, dress pins, armbands, and finger rings. Their wardrobes advertised their success to young men who wished to make a name for themselves. And to finance these lavish wardrobes, Viking chiefs would soon look for bigger prizes. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comment section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.